as Rachael served in the New Hampshire Conference of the United Church of Christ, held standing in the Merrimack Association when she served as the clinical chaplain at New Hampshire Hospital. Rachael is presently serving as pastor of the Living Table United Church of Christ in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She is a poet, having published 2 books of poetry, 3 books of poetry. I only have 2 on my shelf. No. And more recently has published the book titled The Life-Saving Church, Faith Communities and Suicide Prevention. I do want to say that Rachael is a friend. If you're looking for someone to have a stimulating lunch conversation with, she's first choice. A wonderful sense of humor. So I've enjoyed being her pastor, so to speak, during the times that she was in New Hampshire. But in her book, The Life-Saving Church, she addresses issues that are of deep sensitivity to all of us. We can all recall periods in our lives when someone close to us either attempted suicide or committed suicide, and we carry with us the memories of that experience, the impressions of those times. Rachael, in this book, which is a memoir as well as offering the wisdom that she offers, approaches it as someone who has walked through that experience of deep suicidality herself. And it is out of that experience and the experience of the church in those moments that she has written this very helpful book. So I'm very pleased that she's agreed to serve as our keynote speaker today to kind of lead us along this path. And with that, it's not quite Rachael's time, but I turn the time over to Tim Wildman, who will lead us in an opening time of worship.
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here today and see all these faces and to feel connected in the way that we can and strive to. I want to lift up 2 spiritual realities for our worship time this morning, 2 spiritual realities of the human condition. First is represented by Psalm 22, which in Christian tradition we hear from the lips of Jesus as he is dying on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? From the sounds of my groaning. And the second spiritual reality that I want to lift up is found in Ezekiel 26:23. It's essentially the heart transplant that Ezekiel says Israel will receive, going from a heart of stone to a heart of flesh. Seen from a contemplative point of view, this is an entering of the truth that we and all things dwell in the heart of God, while that very heart dwells in us and in all things. Rachael will undoubtedly help us understand today the Psalm 22 reality for people struggling with an ongoing compulsion to end their lives and their loved ones. She will also undoubtedly teach and challenge us to embody in our churches and in our ministries that heart transplant through genuine inclusion and understanding. But now, at the start, as we think about these 2 spiritual realities of Psalm 22 and Ezekiel 36, the sense of being forsaken and beyond help, on one side, and the sake of being of dwelling in the heart of God and having God's heart dwell within us and all things. Now, at the start of that, I'd like to invite us to lament or mourn together, bringing the forsaken, beyond help pain of the world, of our congregations, of our families, of ourselves at this time, into the heart of God through simple music, followed by silent prayer in which we seek to envision that dwelling of all in the heart of the Eternal One. I'm going to ask you to, and this is, not at all risky because everyone is home and you're all muted. So I'm going to ask you to sing one verse at a time of an old spiritual. The first verse is, sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. I'm going to play it and invite you to sing along with me. Second verse is, sometimes I feel like I'm almost done or almost gone. And I invite you to use whichever of those words feels right to you. And the third verse is simply, in the final verse, true believers, a long way from home. True believers. Amen.
So it looks like it's my turn now. So here we are. Thank you, Richard, for that introduction and your kind words, and for inviting me to be with you today. I am very sad that I can't be with you in person for all kinds of reasons, as I'm sure you all share that sadness for not being able to gather in person. Before I really begin, I want to say a few words about Zoom, just because it's still a relatively new platform for most of us, and we may not realize some of what goes on in our bodies when we sit in front of a screen. Zoom exhaustion is a real thing. The way that we perceive information is challenged by Zoom. So if you find yourself getting tired, feel free to look away from the screen for a while. I will make the PowerPoint I have available. You can look at it later if it's one of the things that helps you remember stuff. But if you find yourself getting tired or distracted, look away from the screen for a bit. Our perception is not used to making eye contact with 30 people at a time. So don't feel obligated. Look down, look away, take notes, dance a jig, do whatever you need to do to give your brain a break from this platform. And as Gordon said, by all means, take a walk, get up and stretch, do whatever you need to do to get through this day. We set the agenda before we had any information about Zoom and the brain and human capacity. So we will do our best to vary things so nobody gets overly tired. And if you have questions, you can use the chat feature. Do you all know about that? Yes, if you hover over your screen on the bottom or the top, depending on your device, you'll see an option for chat. Here it is, the chat window. Thank you, Gina. So if you have a question, you're welcome to put it in chat. You can, and Gina will help me pay attention to the chat because I sometimes forget to look at it. Or you can simply take yourself off mute and ask the question. I don't mind being interrupted. If it's a question that you want answered in the moment, we do have time for a Q&A during the day. But if it's a burning question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask it or type it into the chat window. I normally do this in person. I don't tend to use PowerPoint because I find it distracting myself, but I realized for this presentation that PowerPoint is probably the best way to go. And I'll let you know my secret. I've watched some TED Talks on how to do PowerPoint the best so as not to short circuit people's brains or bore them to death. So you'll let me know how I did on that when we are done. So I am going to attempt now to share my screen and enter into the PowerPoint. Let's see. Wow, look at that, it's working. So here we are. Let's see where we go from here. First, I want to thank everyone for coming and choosing to spend your day talking about suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention. I recognize that this is not an optimal time in the life of the world to spend a day talking about a topic as challenging and difficult as this one is. And yet it's probably needed more now than ever. It seems like every day we are reading about the suicide of a medical provider or a first responder. And we need to know how to help, how to respond, how to prevent the spread of suicide. So I recognize that this is not everybody's topic of choice. In fact, I often say that it is the most important conversation we're not having. So you get extra credit for being here today. Richard talked a little bit about why I'm here. You see some lovely images from my childhood. This one here is, I was 14, this is 15 and 16, and you can see there's a significant difference in my overall appearance. Adolescence was not the best time of my life. As Richard indicated, I did struggle for a lot of years with suicidality. I engaged in acute suicidal behavior once that landed me in the hospital, and then I struggled with suicide for years, or suicidality for years after that. In 1983, the day before Valentine's Day, I overdosed and landed in the hospital, and I was there for a week. There were lots of things going on that made that not as lethal as it could have been under other circumstances. The thing that stood out in that was the church's response. Somebody is not on mute that should be on mute. There's some feedback happening. So just double check your mute settings.
Yep, I muted people. Go for it.
Great, thanks. So the church of my childhood, which is the Federated Church of Hyannis in Massachusetts on Cape Cod, was a non-denominational, remotely UCC affiliated. I've never understood why they didn't fully affiliate. They've had UCC pastors since 1976, but we know how stubborn Yankees can be, right? That was funny a little bit, come on. That church was your sort of typical mainline church. It was very busy. It was a church that filled up in the summers. We had things like drive-in church, which would be handy right now these days, I suppose. And there was an active youth group there. You know, it had all of the markers of your fairly typical church. And when I engaged in suicidal behavior, people showed up. The clergy showed up in the emergency room that day, and one of them, they were both named John, which makes it a little confusing, but one of them came and kept coming back, and he and I still have a relationship to this day. I often credited him with saving my life. He says no, but memories are unique things. And it wasn't just the clergy. That summer after I engaged in suicidal behavior, I ended up in Boston Children's Hospital for an eating disorder. And the whole church rallied around. They sent gifts, they sent notes. When I was home on weekends, they welcomed me. They never told me the things that churches often tell people who engage in suicidal behavior. They never said, you're going to hell. They never said, you know, you're possessed by demons, all of the nonsense that has been said from churches and clergy. So that church really altogether saved my life. And it is no doubt responsible for me, at least in part, going into ordained ministry. And I was ordained less than 10 years after I had this bout with suicide and eating disorders. I was by no means well at that point, but I hit it well. So that was an interesting time in my life. And over the course of ministry, church has not always been the most supportive place in my life. A few years after I was ordained, I came out and lost the position I was serving at the time and was out of full-time ministry for 10 years, which really provoked a lot of that questioning of my own self-worth and value and triggered some suicidality yet again, because the church that had been so accepting in my childhood was now completely rejecting who I was as a full human being. Something I celebrated as sort of completing the puzzle of who I was not received that way by the church. During those 10 years, I did some really interesting things. I became a pastoral psychotherapist. I say often that was an accident because I was doing specialized home care, which is caring for people with developmental and mental health issues in my home 24 hours a day. And one of them went to a pastoral counseling center, and I was often the driver. And I was talking with that person's therapist who happened to be the director of the center. And she said, "Why aren't you working for me?" And I'm like, "Because I'm not a therapist." She's like, "Well, you have a degree, don't you?" And I'm like, "I have a master's degree in Christian education and counseling. but I don't have any clinical experience. She's like, oh, you've been a pastor. Let's do this. And so I started working for her as a pastoral psychotherapist, which was an experience that I'm grateful I had. And from there, I ended up being the clinical chaplain at New Hampshire Hospital, which was a surprise to me. And in the first few months, a steep learning curve. But over that time, I was at the hospital for 6 years. And over that time, the most frequently asked question was one of two things. Is suicide a sin? Or am I going to hell if I kill myself? Sometimes it was, how does God feel about suicide? Those questions, I had to come up with an answer. I also had to struggle with my own history because I was taught you don't talk about it. When I was seeking ordination, I was told very clearly not to discuss my past, not to discuss depression or eating disorders or anything like that, just to set it behind me and go forward. So when I started working at the hospital, I was constantly confronted with this thing that I wasn't supposed to talk about. So I was wrestling with that. And then I also started working on the Mental Health Network's board of directors. Y'all know that the United Church of Christ has a mental health network, right? I hope. You'll know more by the time I'm done. So I had started serving on that board of directors, and we were doing Widening the Welcome conferences then, which were in combination with the disabilities ministry and talking about welcoming people with disabilities and mental health issues into our churches. And we were going to be at a location where the nearest church had had a suicide in recent months. And the chair of the board, Alan Johnson, said, shouldn't we have a presentation on suicide and the church's response? And there was like 14 of us on the conference call, and there was absolute silence. And someone said, Rachel, aren't you serving on the state suicide prevention board? Like, yes. Like, so could you do this? And I'm like, yes. So it was from that conference, that request to do a presentation, that the Life Saving Church started to take shape. And when I sent the query to Chalice Press, I was really expecting them to say no. I was convinced they would say no, but they said yes. And it took a couple of years from the time I wrote until it was published, but there it was. And now here we are. And my experiences of my own life and being a therapist and being a clinical chaplain and being a pastor all helped shape my views of responding to suicide, and certainly the Life Saving Church, the book itself. I'm just curious as to how many of you have read the book. So if you have actually read the book, could you indicate it? I'm just curious. You don't lose points if you haven't. Okay, good. So I'm repeating myself for some of you. That's good. Repetition is the way we learn, right? All right. So I want to make sure that I address any questions or topics that you hoped we would address today. So I am going to, again, stop sharing the screen and ask you if there is something that you want to make sure I cover today in terms of the church and responding to suicidality, suicide. Go ahead, Mandy.
Hi, thanks so much. I have a young parishioner who's 23 who has had several attempts, and right now, since social distancing has been going on, is really, really struggling. So a couple of things. One is practical, one is theoretical in a sense. What ways can I be supportive without losing my autonomy and being completely sucked in, which is something that's complicated. And this is a person with several different mental health issues going on. And secondarily, how can I balance both the truism that I hear that you can't cause someone to kill themselves or can't really save their lives, and yet there are ways in which we can make a difference.
Okay.
Thanks.
I'm definitely covering those, so thank you.
Great, thank you.
Other questions, topics? Usually people come to these kinds of things. Go ahead, Ruth. You have to unmute yourself. There we go.
I do a lot of work with people who are preparing for ministry on the more academic side, but a lot of the conversations and whatnot that we have involve their mental health history, and many of them do have some suicidality, at least in their past. Mm-hmm. How can I, as a more educational person in their lives, help them find language that allows them to speak their truth to their committees on ministry, so that they're not having the experience that you had and that many other people have had in the course of ordination, where they've been told to stay silent about that?
Yeah, that's a hard one, because most of our committees on ministry don't have the appropriate training. I have done some training with the Minnesota Conference Committee on Ministry around mental health issues and what is appropriate to ask and what is not appropriate to ask, and how you receive the information if somebody discloses a history of mental health challenges. I often say honesty is best. However, caution is warranted depending on the committee. So if you're working with folks who have a committee on ministry who is not well educated in mental health issues or suicidality, then they want to discuss, if they want to share their past, it's in the past. And then they want to stress that they have adequate coping skills and they know how to receive help, so that the committee is hearing, I have this issue, but this is how I help myself. Even if this is how I help myself is slightly exaggerated, because we're not always able to help ourselves in those moments. But generally speaking, it's not an easy thing. One of my pet projects is to make sure that all of our committees on ministry have adequate training. Nobody listens to me, so.
Rachel, there are a couple questions in the chat window for you.
Okay, let's see. Will you be addressing the issues associated with veteran and first responder suicide? Yes, to an extent. We can talk about why they have an increased suicide rate. I think we know, but we'll talk a little bit about that, sure. Would you explain the difference between suicidality and suicidal ideation? There is no difference. The clinicians on the call can correct me if I'm mistaken, but I think suicidal ideation is how we describe somebody's thinking about suicide. Suicidality is the state of thinking about suicide. So there really isn't a difference. The words can be used interchangeably. Okay. Any other questions? All right. I'll take the silence as a no. And we'll go back in. I'm going to be an expert at this, switching back to PowerPoint. All right. So we're going to jump right in. We're going to spend some time talking about suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention. Postvention might be a new word for some folks. Postvention is simply what happens after suicide. What we say, what we do, how that goes. So in terms of prevention, we're going to look at what suicide prevention actually looks like, why church matters in this, and then some suggested practices. And again, feel free to interrupt with questions as they arise. So we want to talk about the common myths around suicide. And one of those most popular is that those who talk about it will not do it. That is not true. People who talk about suicide, 99% of the time, are actually thinking about suicide, and you don't need to worry about that 1%. So people who talk about it, actually talking about it with someone can help save a life. There's been studies that show, particularly with people who have jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, that as soon as they sort of step off, they realize they don't want to die. They just want the pain to end. So people who are talking about suicide are effectively telling you that they want the psychological pain they're in. I refer to it as psych ache. They want the psych ache to end. So pay attention when someone's talking about it. Another myth is that if we talk to someone about their suicidal thoughts, it will lead them to die by suicide, as if we have that much power over someone. We don't. By asking someone if they're thinking about suicide, we again are possibly helping to save a life, because we are now identifying ourselves as a safe person to talk about those thoughts and feelings with. And that's an important thing. One of the reasons people die by suicide is the shame and stigma around feeling suicidal. And if you have nowhere to go with those feelings, you will die. And then the third thing that we get is suicide is a sin, and you will absolutely go to hell. Now, for some of us in the more progressive end of things, that grates on us a bit, and we have a knee-jerk reaction, which I will talk about later. But these are some of the common myths. We can add to those. When I served on the State Suicide Prevention Council, I was appalled because they first would tell people who are experiencing suicidal thoughts to go and talk with their pastors. And I repeatedly said, for the love of God, please stop saying that. Because most clergy are not prepared to talk about suicide with parishioners. And that's across the gamut of Christianity. I'm not just picking on one side or the other. So clergy, the church has historically had a really unhealthy, ineffective response to people with mental health challenges in general and suicidality in particular. So those are some of the basic myths that are still propagated today.
Rachel, there's sort of a relevant question that popped up on the chat window from Renee.
Okay. Can you just read it? Because
Yeah.
I can't.
Should all COCM be trained on suicide ideation?
Yes. Yes. I think if I had another book to recommend in addition to my own, I would. But the very least, have the committees on ministry read my book. Because to recognize that there are some differences. Someone can be sort of what I refer to as passively suicidal their whole life long and still be an effective, caring pastor. And that by passive suicidality, I mean that sort of level of depression and psychic that you have the thought that would be okay if I didn't wake up in the morning, or it would be okay if I died, but you don't actually have an active suicidality. You're not making plans to die. So it can range from that to people who really have some underlying mental health issues and really struggle with thoughts of suicide. And that's where it impedes the capacity for ministry. So committees should be aware of mental health issues in general, and then more specifically suicidal stuff. Because suicide is one of those interesting things. I believe that every human being at one point in their life will feel suicidal, either as a result of a mental health struggle or a result of circumstances. And that can range quite a bit from that more passive, if I went to sleep and didn't wake up, it would be okay, to the more active, making plans and on how to die. I think everyone will have, if not already has had, that experience, at least in passing. And to recognize that no one is exempt. You know, any one of us could come into circumstances that cause us to be suicidal. What we're seeing with medical staff and first responders in the COVID-19 crisis shows that under extreme stress and the repeated experience of trauma, anyone can become suicidal. I mean, we're seeing doctors die by suicide. Can you imagine being a doctor in New York City where your whole life is about saving lives and hundreds of people you can't save? That would weigh down anyone. Yes, I think everybody everybody who is part of a church should have the conversation around mental health and suicide. That's just my personal bias. I'll put it right out there. So along with that, no one is exempt. Here are some facts about suicide that you may or may not be familiar with. These are national across the country. It's the 10th leading cause of death. It's the second leading cause of death for ages 10 to 34. And I want to say something about that. The age at which we are seeing children engage in suicidal behavior is continuing to drop. It used to be this was for ages 14 to 25 or 14 to 34, but now it is declining. We see suicidal behavior in children as young as 4 or 5, and that is deeply distressing. It's the 4th leading cause of death for ages 35 to 54. And this is always comes as a surprise to people. Middle-aged white men right now have the highest rates of suicide. We think of adolescents as being at the highest risk. Right now, middle-aged white men have the highest rate of suicide, particularly as they get toward retirement age because of the way that we have socialized men, that they are their jobs. And so when you remove the job, you remove the identity, you remove the sense of purpose, you end up with suicidality. It's not quite as simple as that, but I think you understand. There's 129 approximately suicide deaths per day. 90% of those who die by suicide have an underlying diagnosable mental illness at the time of their death. And since someone asked about veterans, veterans have 1.5 times the rate of suicide as their non-veteran peers. So veterans have some of the highest rates of suicide also. Whoops. So for New Hampshire, just to see how you compare, New Hampshire has a higher rate of suicide than the national average. It is the 8th leading cause of death. It is the 2nd leading cause of death for ages 10 to 44. So the range is a little bit higher in New Hampshire. So 4th leading cause of death for ages 45 to 54, and then the 6th leading cause of death for 55 to 64. And this bottom one belongs on the other slide, so just ignore that. So New Hampshire has a higher rate of suicide. I was reading one article that said that the New Hampshire rates of suicide have increased about 40 to 50% over the last 30 years. And it is true that over the last 30 years, the national averages, the numbers have also increased. I don't think quite as much as the New Hampshire, however. There's reasons for that. Rural states often have higher rates of suicide than states that the population density is in the cities. We see a lot of suicide death in Minnesota as well, because it is largely a rural state. So keeping that in mind, we know that religious affiliation has declined over the years. The latest study I saw, I think, was from Gallup that said only 50 to 60% of people report religious affiliation. However, as much as 87% have some belief in God or higher power. So there is still a pervasive sense that there is something greater than us in the universe. So the response that church has to suicidality and mental health issues is important. We still have a voice, we still have a role in people's lives. And if history is any indicator, we will have a bump in religious affiliation after COVID-19 is over, just based on history. So what the Bible actually says about suicide is fascinating. There are, I always get this wrong, 7 or 9, I can't keep it in my head, I don't know why, but I think it's 7 times, could be 9 times, that suicide is mentioned, well, suicides happen in scripture. So 7 people die by suicide in scripture. Most of us can only name the one, right? That would be Judas. But there are others. And the fascinating thing is that the Bible offers no comment at all. It simply says these people died by suicide. They don't use that word, of course. You know, it was Saul and Saul's sword bearer that killed themselves, Judas, some others that you've probably never heard of except in Old Testament class when you memorized a lot of biblical trivia. So the Bible offers no comment, human or God. So the Bible does not tell us God's response to suicide at all. So all of the stuff that we think is true around suicide from a theological perspective is entirely made up by human beings, which probably can be said for a lot of our theology, but bear that in mind. I refer to the United States as having a puritanical preset. That means that our baseline for theology in this country is legalistic and biblically sort of literal. And that is sort of pervasive in our society, in its structure, and in the way we think. And I know that being good UCC folk, you want to say, but I'm not a Bible literalist. And you may not be. You may have worked very hard to undo that. But a lot of our folks still revert to biblical literalism. I remember a couple of years ago, I was preaching a series on Moses and walking through the Exodus. And we just got through the passage about the serpents, and it describes how God sent the serpents to kill the Israelites, and then Moses holds up the staff and they're healed, they're saved. And I talked about all the different ways that why this could be written this way and what it could mean for us and what it meant for the people and blah, blah, blah. I went through the whole thing to undo all of that. And even after the sermon, 3 people came up to me and said, why would God do that to those people? Puritanical preset. And if that doesn't convince you, then there is our insurance system. Our insurance system is built on a puritanical preset, because if you have cardiovascular disease, you can go to the doctor unlimited amounts of time and have that covered, assuming you have medical insurance. If you have mental illness, there is a limit on how much you can go to the doctor, how much therapy you can get without your therapist doing a whole lot of paperwork to beg for more sessions. It's just a bias. We don't respond to mental illness as a biological disease, which it is. All of mental illness is biological. It all takes place in the brain. Even some of those, what we think of as acquired illnesses like PTSD, personality disorders, and some of those other things, there are now studies that show there's a difference in a person's brain. If you have PTSD, if you have a personality disorder, there are parts of your brain that are physically different than brains of people who don't have those issues. So they are biologically based, and we should be treating them that way instead of sort of passively endorsing the archaic theology that mental illness is caused by demons, it is punishment for sin, it is sign of weak faith or lack of character. It's none of those things. It really is biological in its at its core. And so we'll talk more about the puritanical preset as we go along, because it really governs our theological views. The other flaw in church, if we are willing to talk about mental health and suicidality at all, we often choose theology, right theology, over psychology, which means we are choosing to endorse our own personal theology over what the person who come to us seeking help may need. That's a bias in United States church on both sides of the theological divide, by the way. So if we want to look a little bit more specifically on what the Bible says, there are 2 unforgivable sins: blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, and then willfully sinning after conversion, what the Catholic Church refers to as impenitence. You'll notice what is not named here as an unforgivable sin. Suicide is not listed as an unforgivable sin. So all that we have manufactured around suicide is just that, it's manufactured. Does not mean we should throw it all out the window, though. We need to tread very carefully when we're responding to people who are suicidal or who have lost a loved one to suicide. What we say and the beliefs we endorse can be protective factors or they can be risk factors. Do you all know what I mean in a clinical sense when I'm talking about protective versus risk factors? Some yes, some no. Okay. So a protective factor is just that. It is something that is a positive influence in the person's life. And so when we're talking about suicidality, we're talking about those things that counter the message of worthlessness. So being part of a community, having supports, feeling connected to family members, feeling connected and needed in various places in life can be protective factors, versus risk factors, which are things that contribute to the likelihood that someone will die by suicide when we're talking about suicide. So some risk factors might be mental health condition, having had a family member die by suicide, losing a job, lots of things can be risk factors. So when we are talking to someone, we want to make sure that what we're saying, the theology that we're endorsing, is a protective factor, not a risk factor. And I'll talk more about that as we go on. And if we are not careful, we spread contagion. And contagion, when we're talking about suicide, of course, we don't mean contagion the way COVID-19 is contagious. Suicidal contagion, we've seen it a lot with adolescents. You know, because adolescents, they feel what they feel when they feel it and don't believe they'll ever feel anything different. So if they lose a friend or a classmate to suicide, they are much more likely to develop suicidal ideation and engage in suicidal behavior. And the things that we say as clergy could contribute to that contagion if we aren't careful. The other thing we want to keep in mind is that the life expectancy in the United States has declined for a couple of years in a row prior to COVID-19. I'm sure COVID-19 will also have an impact on that. But life expectancy has declined with two significant contributing factors. One is the increase in suicide rates, and the other is the opioid crisis. And they are intimately related. I have never met someone with an addiction who did not also have an underlying mental health issue. The opioid crisis and the rate of suicidality or the rate of suicide are intimately connected to the pervasive sense of hopelessness that exists in the United States. And that existed prior to COVID-19. And I don't think it's coincidental that our suicide rates have gone up while our religious affiliation numbers have gone down. There's lots of reasons for that. And I'm not saying that religious affiliation is always good or always bad. I just think the two are correlated. And if you remember from any statistics classes you ever had, correlation does not imply causation. One is not a cause of the other, but there is a relationship between them. All right. All right, so to go toward risk factors, these are some of the common ones. There are plenty of things that can contribute to suicide risk, but prior episodes of suicidal behavior, past behavior is the best indication of future behavior. Substance abuse, mood disorders, access to lethal means. If you don't have access to lethal means, you're less likely to die by suicide. Trauma, and then grief or loss. And right now in COVID-19, trauma, grief, and loss are things we ought to be paying attention to, as well as pre-existing mental health conditions. For many who did not have pre-existing mental health conditions, they are struggling with depression and anxiety today because of the national and world circumstances. So imagine being someone who previously struggled with a mental health condition, and now you are trying to navigate a world that's as anxious and as depressed and feeling overwhelmed as you are on a regular basis. So it magnifies it. So I've already talked a little bit about the impact of current trauma and loss on physicians and first responders and other frontline workers. So these are things to pay attention to. Just because someone has these things does not mean they will be suicidal or that they will die by suicide, because we balance risk factors with protective factors. And if you have enough protective factors to balance out these risk factors, you're less likely to engage in suicidal behavior.
Rachel, we got a question.
Yep.
Could you give an example of spreading contagion by what we may say in the aftermath of a suicide? For instance, as it relates to the example you gave about an adolescent suicide.
Okay, so if you are, I will go into more detail on this later, but for now, if you're the pastor and you're doing the memorial service for the person, the young one who's died by suicide, there's a few things you could do that would increase the likelihood that someone in the congregation that day engages in suicidal behavior. One is you could assure them that their loved one is in heaven. And that sounds a little odd, but if you assure someone who is feeling suicidal that they will go to heaven, they won't go to hell, you increase the likelihood that they will die by suicide. You could also name the means by which someone engaged in suicidal behavior and died, and then you have confirmed lethal means. These are things that if I haven't done them, I've seen someone do. So it's not impossible that this could happen. So those are two of the things. And I'll talk more about what to say and not to say when I get to the postvention section. But that is a good question. We have a huge responsibility when we are leading a service for someone who has died by suicide.
Okay, so I'll just tack it or flag it and come back to it too and make sure that we later.
Yep.
Cool. Okay, thanks.
All right. So protective factors. Not my puppy, but cute picture. So here are some of the protective factors to balance out some of those risk factors. Number one protective factor is access to effective mental health care. Doesn't matter how effective the mental health care is if you have no access. And I am intimately aware of the frequent lack of access in New Hampshire. It's true in Minnesota as well, but I had more direct experience with the lack of access in New Hampshire. And I know the state has taken some steps to try to address that, but access to effective mental health care is one of the primary protective factors. Others, connectedness to individual, family, community, social institutions. This is where church comes in. Positive connection, not connections that are fraught with difficulty and conflict, but positive connections. Problem-solving skills, also helpful. In contact with caregivers. Problem-solving skills are important because depression lies. Depression is the great deceiver as far as I'm concerned. Depression tells you that you are worthless, that you are unlovable, that your loved ones will be better off without you, that you contribute nothing of value to the world. This is the voice of depression. And when you are experiencing it, there is nothing that will convince you that depression is lying to you. This becomes your worldview, which is why when people die by suicide, the response of the survivors is often, well, that was so selfish. But I assure you, the person who died by suicide or engaged in suicidal behavior doesn't see it as selfish at all. They see it as saving loved ones from pain, because they really cannot believe their death will cause anybody extreme pain, because depression lies. So having problem solving skills is very helpful at that point, if you can get somebody to engage with their problem solving skills. All right. So we have risk factors. Now we want to look at who is at risk. People with chronic medical conditions, usually that involve chronic pain. Studies have shown that chronic pain has the same impact on the brain as depression. Something to keep in mind. People with mental health or mental health illness or substance use disorders. People who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, I want to comment on that, because being LGBTQ in any way is not pathological. It's the rejection that folks still experience in the world that contributes to psychic, which leads to suicidality. I just want to clarify, I'm not saying this is pathological or that every person who is queer will be suicidal, but it is a risk factor. Clearly, members of the military and veterans, active military and veterans, and we could throw in police officers and other first responders. There's lots of reasons for that. The primary contributing factor is trauma, PTSD. For military folk, it could be moral injury, which is in some ways a deeper level of trauma. And the culture in the military is that you suck it up and deal. But you know, the human psyche can only suck up so much. And military is not necessarily known for being very selective about accepting folks who come in with trauma. You know, military these days appeals to a lot of lower income folks. And if you live in a lower income situation, you are more likely to have experienced significant trauma. So all of these things combine to put veterans and military personnel and other first responders at higher risk. And then we see men in midlife and older men. And we've already talked a little bit about that. That's the one that often surprises people. Again, it's the way that we socialize men. And ladies, I say it's only going to be another generation or so before we're right up there with them, because, you know, men are supposed to be, you know, the providers, and their work is their identity. And women from Gen X on down also have had that opportunity to make their work their identity. All right, I know that I have thrown a lot of information. I want to just check in and see if there are other questions, if you're still with me, still breathing. I should probably stop the share for a moment so we can look at each other here. Maybe.
I see some thumbs up, Rachel.
That we're good? We're good. All right. All right.
Larry had a question that he put on the chat.
Which we talked about. Yep, which
okay.
I popped up and we talked about, and Rachel said she's going to come back to it later. Yep.
All right. So then we have talked about risk factors. We've talked about what populations are at risk. And so now we want to look at warning signs. So we have talk, mood, and behavior. Those are the three areas that should raise red flags. The talk is if someone starts saying things like, my life has no meaning, the world would be better off without me, I have no hope. Those are indicators that maybe there's something deeper going on. Changes in mood. Somebody becomes suddenly joyful. or upbeat when they have been very depressed. There is no medication on the planet that would cause a sudden shift. A sudden shift in mood can mean that someone has made a decision to die by suicide. It's important. If there are other dramatic shifts in mood, if somebody goes from being elated to being depressed, that's an indicator that there could be a mental health issue, may or may not be suicidal. But mood changes, significant changes in mood are something we want to consider, especially if they are sudden. And changes in behavior. You know, a person who was previously engaged in various activities becomes isolated, not in engaging in any activities previously enjoyed, using substances with increased frequency or increased proportions, eating more or eating less, sleeping more or sleeping less. There's, you know, changes in behavior of just normal everyday behavior changes. Changes in these three things may indicate that someone is thinking about suicide. And these are important to pay attention to. And we'll get into other stuff after our break. And I see that we're already a little bit over time, but all right. Oh, going the wrong way. So, suicide prevention, what the church can do. Research indicates overwhelmingly that positive affiliation and involvement in a faith community improves health outcomes, improves satisfaction with life. So these things are connected. And we know that church involvement, when it's a positive interaction, can be a protective factor. I keep stressing when it's positive because we know that with, particularly with LGBTQ youth and young adults, that if they're in a conservative church that does not affirm them, that increases the likelihood that they'll engage in suicidal behavior. And that's probably true for other populations, but LGBTQ youth have been actually, studies are coming out telling us what we already knew. The other thing you need to do is you need to know the warning signs, the things that we just talked about, the changes in talk, behavior, and mood. So education is the best thing you can do for prevention. And then you want to ask your church these questions, which you'll have opportunity in small group to talk about. What message does your congregation embody? Is it true welcome or is it something else? And how can you improve the messaging of your church, of your congregation? All right. So I think it's time for a stretch, small groups, unless we're a little bit late, but I think we can handle it.
So should we give people maybe 5 minutes and then come back and go into small groups? Does that sound like it's an okay thing to do?
Yes.
So folks, I have 11:12. What if we come back at, what if we give them, you want to give them 8 minutes? You want to come back at 11:20?
Sure.
Okay, so I'll see you at 11:20 and we'll throw you into small groups. Sound good?
Great.
All right, have a stretch.